let's start this presentation the way I like to start a lot of my class presentations, with a video. Hope we have volume.
Nation, tonight is the all-important Florida primary. Now, normally I do my show live, but tonight I pre-taped it at 7:30 because that is midnight for the average Floridian. So I don't know whether Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich won, but we do know one thing for certain. Tomorrow, both of them can go back to ignoring Latinos. Now,
yes, it's a joke. Jorge Ramos of Univision would call it what, the Christopher Columbus syndrome. Every 4 years, they would discover the Latino vote. And it's an interesting thing. How do I get back to? So back in 2000, as you'll recall, I'm sure many of you will, I was a producer at NPR's Latino USA during the contentious 2000 election. And if you'll recall, first Gore was announced the winner, and then they said, no, it's Bush. And then they said, it's too close to call. And one of the reasons in our coverage, as we were looking at this, that they got it wrong, there was a lot of focus on exit pollings. And they got the Latino segment of the exit polling very wrong because they had oversampled the Cuban influence of the Latino vote. And so, you know, there was a lot of focus, and they corrected a lot of the exit pollings. But to understand exit polling, you really have to understand the community that this is coming from. We've known for a while that there have been changes in the Latino community in Florida. Early on, it was dominated by Cuban-American politics. Cubans are all over the state, as you can see, but a greater concentration in the Miami-Dade area. Very exile politics related, and that meant traditionally more conservative. At the same time, there was other sorts of immigration going on in Florida. There was a growing Puerto Rican population that was going there, not only from New York, but also from the island of Puerto Rico. I remember in 2003 when the Orlando Sentinel started having a full-time correspondent from San Juan as part of their staff. So there was changing going on. And that was important because it was hard to predict now how this subgroup, how this population was going to influence politics. Indeed, in 2004, Florida's Hispanic vote supported Bush. In 2008, they supported Obama. So clearly by 2012, the Cuban Florida vote in Florida no longer defined what the overall Hispanic vote in Florida was going to be. And there was also something interesting that was happening. In late 2011, Florida GOP moved its primary earlier in the calendar to January 36th from March 6th. And those of us who had been covering ethnic politics, this was interesting because a lot of the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, not a lot of Latinos there, not a lot of blacks there. And so we had to wait till later on in the calendar to sort of study this thing. South Carolina, a large African-American community there, and then a week later, it was Florida, a large Latino population, and so we could study this. We can look at this earlier in the calendar, in the political calendar. So I thought this would be, we had a great opportunity here to look at two distinct Latino populations, both with strong political involvement during a heightened political atmosphere. Both communities that I'm looking at, Orlando and Miami, they had influential daily newspapers that not only constituted a dominant market in the English language, but both produced sister publications in Spanish to deal with that segment of the population. So I set out to compare each community's coverage of Latino politics, to compare it against each other, to compare it also by language. And obviously, I expected differences by region. The politics of Miami-Dade was going to be different from the politics of Orlando. But I also expected differences by language. And so I set out to do this. I set out to study this. Because I understood that most news organizations do target their audiences. They target their coverage to their audiences. So I decided to do a framing study. I thought that would work best. I chose to do a content analysis of each publication's coverage of Latino politics, and I chose to use the lens of immigration. Now, in the paper, it makes the case of why to use this lens of immigration. Immigration's a hot-button political issue, and actually, Latinos are not as liberal on the issue as many people think. Polls show they're not generally in favor of open borders, of free and open borders. Most respect and desire the rule of law. But where they really get fired up is when politicians and the media all castigate Latinos as all immigrants, and therefore somehow undeserving of all the rights and privileges of American citizenship. And that really then starts to tie immigration as an issue with civil rights in the eyes of many Latinos. So I chose to do a framing study because how words are used and by whom reflect certain power dynamics. I wanted a paper that sort of delved into those areas. So these were my research questions. I focused my study during the month of the GOP presidential primary. It was January 2012. So during that month, in all 4 publications, English, Spanish, in both communities, I searched for everything in English and Spanish that had to do with the Latino vote or the Hispanic vote, using the terms mixed. And I gathered all those articles. I did not create a data set using immigration or immigrant or any of those words. But in 80% of all the articles I found, more than 80%, immigration was there. So that sort of gives you a good hint, obviously, that the media had a role in perpetuating this frame of immigration and Latinos. So I thought I was in the right track. So, 2 bilingual coders, we identified 323 individual cases of what we called immigration frames. We called them frames, how they framed immigration. You can debate the definition of framing. We can go have a beer at the Dog and Duck and get into it if you want to, of what constitutes a frame and what doesn't. But anyway, these are the major areas that we agreed as coders: political issue, anti-immigrant, policy and enforcement, and we came up with these mega categories based on the 323 times we came across immigration frames. Now, that's interesting, but, we're academics. This is an academic panel. We got to do some kind of statistical analysis or we're not doing research, right? So I compared just the English versions of the newspapers, and there were significant differences in the frames that each one used. If you look closely, I don't know if you can see, Miami, they were more focused on policy and enforcement. Orlando, they were more talking about illegal and undocumented immigrants, and the rest are kind of similar. You do the same thing in Spanish, and yes, we found significant differences. In Miami, El Nuevo Herald was more focused on anti-immigration. El Sentinel was political issue and more reformer stance, particularly talking about the DREAM Act. There were some issues I had to take out. I also took out 2 of those, 6 and 7, because of blank cells of 0. And I take those out and I redo the numbers, and that p-value actually goes below 0.1. So it gets even more significant if you take out the missing values. That's just doing statistics. Then I also wanted to test the English language version of a newspaper against its Spanish language sister publication. And I did not find statistical differences, significant differences. In Miami, or Orlando. This was surprising to me. You would think there would be differences between English and Spanish. So what does all this mean? Obviously, different communities frame issues differently. If I were to do the same study in Houston or Los Angeles, a place with a big Mexican-American community, and Mexicans and Mexican-Americans are the majority of Latinos in this country, I'm sure I would get different results. I would probably find the same frames being used. It would be very hard, though, to still compare sister publications. There are very few daily Spanish language newspapers in this country. There are even fewer English-Spanish sister publications published by the same entity. Mostly what you get is one that will do an insert, a weekly, even border places like in Laredo and in the Rio Grande Valley. They have a dominant English language newspaper, and they have inserts that only come out 3 times a week, not the whole daily regimen. But I will continue to do that sort of research. That's going to be the subject of my dissertation. I thought it was a very fun little paper, and I'm going to keep at it. We can slice this many, many different ways. Thank you.